The promontory of Carthage extended into the Gulf of Tunis at the point where the coast of North Africa bends inward, and where the line of the Mediterranean opens towards Sicily 90 nautical miles to the northeast. The sea on three sides was shallow and calm, sheltered from the open Mediterranean by the headland of Cap Bon to the east, and the inland air was dry, the rainfall meager, the soil reddish-brown and thin over a bedrock of soft yellow sandstone. The headland rose gently from the water, then climbed in a low curve to a pair of summits. The larger, called Bursa, ringed in time by a triple wall of stone and brick, and the smaller called Juno to the north, given to a temple precinct of the goddess Tanit. Between the two hills, the ground fell in terraces toward the sea, and the orientation of the modern villas above the shoreline still traces the lines of the ancient streets. To the north of the promontory lay the Sebca Ariana, a brackish lagoon that flooded in winter and shrank to a salt pan in summer. To the south lay the Lake of Tunis, broader and shallower, separated from the Gulf by a long sandbar. Between the two bodies of water, the land narrowed to an isthmus of less than 5 kilometers, and this isthmus was the only land approach to the city. The value of the position was not the elaboration of its harbors, which came later, but the simple geometry of a peninsula with limited access by land, well watered by springs and by rainfall cisterns, and set in view of the long maritime routes that ran along the African coast toward the Pillars of Heracles in the west, and across to Sicily and to Sardinia in the north. The hinterland behind the isthmus opened into a plain of olive groves and grain fields, the Megara suburb of the ancient texts, watered by seasonal streams running down from the lower hills of Sidi Bou Said. Beyond the plain, the country rose into the dorsal range, the spine of what is now Tunisia, and beyond that, into the high steppe and the salt lakes of the south. To the east, the coast curved toward the headland of Cap Bon, where the smaller Punic settlement of Kerkouan stood through the 5th and 4th centuries before it was abandoned at the conclusion of the First Punic War. To the southwest, the road from Carthage ran inland through the wheat country to Thuga and to Utica, the older Phoenician colony that the new foundation eventually overshadowed. The climate of the headland was Mediterranean in its purest expression. A cool, wet winter ran from November into April, with rainfall concentrated in short and sometimes heavy storms. A long, dry summer followed, in which the temperature rose into the mid-30s Celsius. The Etesian winds blew steadily from the north, the fields dried, and the merchant ships ran west under sail. A brief spring of almond and olive blossom, an autumn in which the grapes ripened, the figs ripened, and the rains returned. The cisterns of the city were sized to hold the winter rainfall against the summer drought, and the springs of the lower hills, particularly the springs of Hammam Leaf on the southern shore of the Gulf, supplied the additional water needed in the long, dry months. The agricultural calendar followed by the country estates of the Carthaginian aristocracy was preserved in the agricultural treatise of Mago, a writer of the 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era, of which fragments survived in Latin and Greek translation after the emptying of the city. Offshore, the island of Zembra rises sheer from the sea 60 kilometers east of the promontory. The smaller island of Zembretta lies near it. On a clear day, the line of the Sicilian coast was visible from the higher ground of Bursa, the headland of Lilybaeum, a low mark on the northern horizon. These sightlines mattered. The naval theater of the western Mediterranean, contested through the centuries of the Punic Wars, ran along this axis from the Bay of Tunis to the western coast of Sicily, and the placement of the Carthaginian harbors took account of the sailing distances, the prevailing winds, and the position of the rival Greek colonies on Sicily and the south coast of Italy. The vegetation of the promontory in antiquity was a mixture of cultivated and wild Mediterranean species. Olive trees, set in disciplined rows on the lower slopes and across the inland plain, were the central crop, and the wild relatives of the olive grew on the headlands where the soil was thinnest. Fig and almond and pomegranate were grown in the orchards close to the houses. Grapevines ran in low rows in the country estates of the Cora. Carob and laurel and the wild oleaster filled the uncultivated patches. The maquis of the higher ground was a low scrub of rosemary, lentisk, and dwarf juniper, and the marshlands of the Sebca carried reeds, tamarisk, and salt grasses, the haunt of waterfowl that the inhabitants of the city took with nets and with clay pellet slings. The land animals of the hinterland in the 8th century before the Common Era were more abundant than at present. North African elephants, smaller in size than their sub-Saharan cousins, ranged the wooded foothills of the dorsal until they were taken by the Carthaginian armies for use in war. Lions and Atlas bears inhabited the higher mountains. Barbary sheep and gazelles ran the open plain. The rivers and lagoons held the populations of fish that fed the city's markets. The slow attrition of these populations over the long Punic centuries and their final disappearance in the Roman period is visible in the faunal record of the excavated sites, in the iconography of the carved stelae of the Tophet, and in the literary references of the writers of the later empire who looked back on a wilder Africa than they themselves saw. The bedrock of the headland, the soft yellow sandstone that was quarried in place for the building of the city, broke easily under the chisel, but held well against the weather once cut and laid. The same stone, worn smooth by centuries of sea wind and rain, is still visible in the modern shoreline at the foot of Bursa, where the bedrock cuts of the ancient ship sheds remain along the curve of the inner harbor. The land remembers what was said in it. The city climbed the slopes of Bursa in terraced blocks of multi-story houses, separated by streets laid on a regular orthogonal grid that excavators have traced beneath the later Roman levels of the Colonia of Carthago. The Greek historian Appian, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era from sources now no longer in direct survival, described houses of 6 floors along the main streets, the lower floors of dressed stone and the upper ones of mud brick on timber framing, with stair towers of stone climbing the inside walls. Modern excavation has confirmed the broad outline of his description. At the Hannibal quarter on the southern slope of the hill, French and Tunisian archaeologists have cleared a block of Punic houses preserved beneath the rubble of the Roman period above, their walls standing to the level of the first floor, and their painted plaster still visible in places where the heat of the final fire baked rather than burned the lime. The houses were planned around a small interior courtyard, often less than 4 meters across, paved with stone slabs or with a fine concrete called opus signinum tinted red by the addition of crushed brick. The courtyard held the cistern mouth, a single-stepped opening cut into the floor, and descending 2 or 3 meters into a bell-shaped reservoir excavated from the bedrock and lined with the same red opus signinum. The roofs of the surrounding rooms sloped inward, gathering the winter rains into clay channels that emptied into the cistern. From this single household reservoir came the day's water, drawn up in painted jugs by the women of the house, and from the runoff that overflowed in heavy storms came a slow seepage that fed the lower gardens and the street-side gutters. The streets of the lower city ran in straight lines from north to south and from east to west, paved with the local sandstone and graded gently toward the harbors so that the rainwater carried away the dust and the daily refuse. Subterranean drains ran beneath the major streets, vaulted in stone and lined with hydraulic plaster, and these drains have been mapped in some detail beneath the modern archaeological park. At the foot of the slope, the streets opened onto the agora, a roughly rectangular public space surrounded by porticos, beyond which the ground fell again toward the 2 harbors. The processional way from the agora to the temple of Eshmun on the summit of Bursa climbed a long stone stair, and the upper portion of this stair has been recovered in section along the modern French archaeological cuttings. The two harbors were the most distinctive single feature of the city's architecture, and the curve of one of them is still legible in the landscape today. The outer harbor was a rectangular basin some 500 meters long, opening directly onto the Gulf, fronted by warehouses and the offices of the maritime merchants. Behind it, accessed by a narrow channel that ran beneath a paved causeway, lay the inner harbor, a circular basin about 325 meters across, in the center of which stood a small artificial island. The island and the curving inner shore of the basin together held 170 covered ship sheds, each large enough to receive a single quinquereme, the long-oared warship of the Punic and Hellenistic Mediterranean. The slipways of these sheds were cut into the bedrock and ramped gently down into the water, allowing a ship to be drawn out for the winter or for repair. The roofs of the sheds were carried on rows of Ionic columns, the bases of some of which were recovered in excavation in the early 20th century, and the upper galleries of the central island held the offices of the naval administration. The walls of the city ran in 3 concentric lines across the isthmus, an arrangement described by the Greek historian Polybius after his visit to the city in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The outermost wall was of mud brick on a stone footing. The middle wall was a stone curtain pierced by towers and surmounted by a fighting platform. The innermost and largest wall, on the city side, was about 10 meters thick at the base, and within its thickness ran chambers for the housing of a garrison and the stabling of war elephants. A trench preceded the outer wall on the landward side, and within the inner ring lay the open ground used for the assembly of armies and the parking of supply trains during a siege. Within the walls, the temples of the city occupied the high ground. The temple of Eshmun, set on the summit of Bursa, was the largest sanctuary of the city, and it was approached by the long stone stair from the agora. The temple of Melkart, on the lower harbor, was older, dating from the original Phoenician foundation. Its rites resembled those of the parent shrine at Tyre. The temple of Resheph, the war god, lay on the western slope. The temple of Astarte, the consort of Melkart, stood on the Juno hill north of Bursa. The Punic temples followed a Levantine plan, a forecourt with an altar of burnt offering, a vestibule, a long cella with the cult statue at the far end, and a closed chamber behind the statue for the storage of cult objects and votive deposits. The country estates of the Carthaginian aristocracy, set across the Chora of the Megara plain, were built on a different pattern: a central villa with a colonnaded courtyard, a series of agricultural buildings around the courtyard, and a circuit of walled gardens beyond. These estates were the subject of the agricultural treatise of Mago, and the treatise described in considerable detail the layout of the villa, the placement of the wine press and the oil press, the construction of the threshing floor, and the orientation of the stables and granaries. After the emptying of the city, the treatise was translated into Latin and into Greek by order of the Roman Senate, and it remained an authoritative work on agriculture for centuries. The mortuary architecture of Carthage lay outside the walls, on the slopes of the Juno hill and along the coast to the south. The tombs were rock-cut shaft graves, descending vertically 2 to 4 meters from the surface to a horizontal chamber, in which the body was laid on a stone bench and the grave goods set around it. Some chambers held a single burial, others held the successive burials of a family over generations. The painted plaster of some of these tomb chambers has survived, and the iconography is consistent: ships at sea, sun and moon discs, palm fronds, fish, the symbol of Tanit in its standardized triangular form. In the first hour before sunrise, The bakers along the lower terraces of Bursa fired their clay ovens with olive prunings and the dried stalks of the previous season's grain, and the heat rose into the cold morning air in pale columns. The bakers worked in small shop fronts opening onto the side streets, their ovens domed and set into the back wall of the shop, and the bread they drew at first light was a flat, round loaf of barley, or of mixed barley and wheat, eaten warm with olive oil and salt. The smell of the new bread carried down the slope toward the harbors, mingled with the smell of the harbor water itself, brackish and faintly salt, and with the smell of the dried fish that the harbor warehouses held. The fishermen of the commercial basin came in through the harbor mouth in the gray hour before sunrise, their boats low in the water with the night's catch, and they tied up along the stone quays and unloaded their fish into wicker baskets. The catch was tuna and bluefish in the summer months, sea bream and gilthead in the winter, sardines and anchovies running through the lower Gulf in great schools at certain times of the year. The smallest fish were salted and dried in the open air on the harbor frontage, racked on wooden frames in the sun, and were sold throughout the city to the household kitchens. The larger fish went to the salting houses along the shore south of the harbor, where they were cut into pieces, packed in coarse salt in stone vats, and prepared for the production of garum, the fermented fish sauce that was a staple of Punic and later Mediterranean cooking. In the residential blocks above the harbor, the household courtyards opened to the morning, and the women of the house came down from the upper rooms with painted jugs to draw water from the cistern. The cisterns held the cold of the night well into the morning, and the first water of the day was used for the household's drinking and for the washing of small children. Heavier water needs were met by the public wells that stood in some of the squares of the lower city, and by the public fountains that ran along the agora's edge from the springs of the lower hills. The women carrying the day's water were a daily presence in the streets of Carthage, as they were in every Mediterranean city of the Iron Age, and the painted iconography of the household scene on Punic stelae preserves them in the act of drawing and carrying. The shopkeepers opened the wooden shutters of their street-front shops with the first light. The streets near the agora held a concentration of trades. The metal workers' shops with their forges glowing red even in the morning sun, the cloth merchants with their bolts of linen and woolen cloth in undyed cream and in the various shades of madder and indigo, the perfume sellers with their small alabaster bottles of scented oil, the leather workers with their belts and sandals, and the cut hides hung from the shop front. The traffic of the morning streets was animal-drawn rather than wheeled in the upper city, where the streets were too narrow and too steep for ox carts. Donkeys carried the baskets of charcoal and the amphorae of fish sauce up the slope from the harbor warehouses to the markets, and at the lower agora, the ox carts of the country estates of the Megara suburb came in with the grain and the wine and the oil of the inland Cora. The scribes of the city walked to the public archives in the lower agora through the same streets, carrying the wooden writing tablets coated with wax that they used for daily accounts, and the longer texts on papyrus rolls or on the inscribed potsherds that served as informal records. The Punic script of Carthage was a derivative of the Phoenician alphabet, written from right to left, and it served the administrative needs of a commercial city. Contracts of sale, leases of land, dedications of votive objects in the temples, accounts of the maritime ventures of the merchant houses. Some of these texts survive on stone in the form of the dedicatory inscriptions of the Tophet and the temples. Some survive on the wax tablets and papyri, only in the form of carbonized fragments. The day's correspondence and contract-making was a city-wide activity, and the scribes were as integral to the morning streets as the bakers and the fishermen. The morning offerings in the temples began with the first light of the sun on the painted columns of the temple porches. At the temple of Eshmun on Bursa, the priests presented loaves of bread, jars of new oil, and small portions of meat to the cult statue, and the offerings were withdrawn after a measured interval and consumed by the temple staff. At the temple of Melkart at the harbor, a similar morning offering was made, with the addition of a libation of wine. At the smaller shrines along the streets, household offerings were left on the thresholds by the householders themselves: a small loaf, a few olives, a cup of milk for an infant who had died, a portion of fruit for the dead of the family. The schools of the city opened at the temple porches, the children sitting on the stone benches of the porch and learning the Punic letters under the eye of a priest or a scribe paid by the temple. The instruction was in reading, writing, and the calculations of weights and measures used in the city's commerce, and the more advanced students learned the Greek alphabet as well, the Greek being the lingua franca of the Mediterranean by the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, and the language in which Punic merchants conducted much of their business with the cities of Sicily and southern Italy. By the second hour after sunrise, the day's work was fully underway. The agora was thronged with merchants and shoppers and water carriers and the slow movement of ox carts. The harbors were active with the unloading of merchant ships that had arrived in the night. The workshops of the metal and leather and cloth trades were producing. The schools were in session. The temples were holding their second offering. The city was at its morning rhythm, and the rhythm would continue with the gradual slowing of the midday heat until the long evening unwound it. The dominant material of Carthaginian construction was the local sandstone, a soft yellow stone of marine sedimentary origin that outcropped along the headland and was quarried in place. The masonry tradition of the city used this stone in dressed ashlar blocks, laid in alternating courses of headers and stretchers without bedding mortar, the joints dressed so fine that a knife blade could not be inserted between the stones. This bond, called pseudisodomic in the Greek architectural terminology that the Romans later adopted, was the standard of public and high-status private construction throughout the Punic centuries. The smaller domestic walls were of mud brick on a stone footing, the mud brick a mixture of clay and straw and small stones, formed in wooden molds and sun-dried for several weeks before laying. The upper stories of the multi-floor houses were timber-framed, with palm wood and cedar beams supporting wooden floors and ceilings, and the roofs were a single layer of clay tiles laid over wooden battens. The pottery of Carthage followed a Phoenician tradition that the colony brought with it from Tyre and adapted to local clays. The diagnostic Punic vessel was the amphora, a narrow torpedo-shaped storage and shipping container with a small ovoid body, a long neck, and two small handles set high on the shoulders. The amphora was made for the transport of olive oil, wine, fish sauce, and dried fish, and the shape was so distinctive that archaeologists today can identify a Punic shipwreck from the silhouette of its scattered amphorae alone. The clay was the local marl of the inland plain, the firing temperature around 950 degrees Celsius, and the finish a buff-colored slip that masked the underlying red of the fired clay. The handles of the amphorae were often stamped with a single Punic letter, or with a short two-letter mark, identifying the producing workshop, and the bodies were sometimes painted with simple decorative motifs in dark brown or in black slip. The fine tableware of the city was largely imported, the locally produced fine wares being limited in range and quality. Greek black figure and red figure vases came in from Corinth in the 7th and 6th centuries, and from Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries, the trade running through Sicilian and southern Italian intermediaries. The Carthaginian aristocracy collected these vessels, and they appear in the grave goods of the rock-cut tombs in some numbers. The vases used as drinking cups, mixing bowls for wine, and storage jars for cosmetic oils. After the 4th century, the imports shifted to the Hellenistic centers of the eastern Mediterranean, with fine wares arriving from Pergamon and from Alexandria. The masonry of the city was supplemented by the use of stucco, a fine lime plaster applied to walls and to the moldings of architectural elements. The stucco was painted in red and white and yellow ochres, and on some surviving wall fragments in the Hannibal quarter, the painted patterns include geometric meanders, palmettes, and the standardized triangular symbol of the goddess Tanit. The plaster was applied in 3 layers: a rough coat of lime mortar and sand, a medium coat of finer mortar, and a finish coat of pure lime tinted with the desired pigment. The finish was burnished while still damp with a smooth stone or a piece of marble, producing a slightly glossy surface that took the pigment evenly. Metalworking at Carthage was a major industry, conducted in the lower city near the harbors and in the workshops along the southern slope of Bursa. The principal metals were bronze and iron, and lead and silver. The bronze workers cast a wide range of objects in Sire-Perdue casting and in 2-piece molds: votive razors with their characteristic spatulate blade and open-work handle, brooches and fibulae of the Phoenician type with a long pin and a hinged catch, weights for the commercial balance, in the form of small bronze cubes or hemispheres stamped with the Punic letters of their denomination, and tools and small fittings for the maritime trade. The iron workers produced agricultural implements, weapons, and the iron fittings of ships, the iron arriving in the city as bar stock from the mines of southern Spain and of the African interior. Lead was used for the weights of fishing nets, for the lining of cisterns, for piping in the larger houses, and for the small inscribed lead tablets used in private rituals and in the casting of curses. Silver, supplied principally from the Sierra Morena mines in southern Spain, was the basis of the Carthaginian monetary system from the late 5th century onward. The textile industry of Carthage was concentrated in the dye works along the coast at Kerkuane and on the offshore island of Meninx in the Gulf of Gabes, both within the Carthaginian commercial sphere. The signature product of these dye works was the purple cloth, dyed with the secretion of the murex shell, a process that involved the collection of the shells in their hundreds of thousands, the extraction of the dye gland, and the controlled fermentation of the gland material in stone vats over a period of weeks. The resulting dye, a deep reddish purple at higher concentrations and a pinker shade at lower, was applied to wool and to silk imported from the eastern Mediterranean, and the dyed cloth commanded high prices throughout the Mediterranean world. The shell middens at Kerkuane are still visible in section along the eroding coast, and the fermentation vats remain in their stone settings in the dyer's quarter of the site. The smell of the production was famously unpleasant, and the dye works were always set on the prevailing wind side of the cities they served. Wood for construction and for shipbuilding was imported from outside the immediate region. The local Mediterranean species, olive and fig and almond and carob, produced excellent furniture timber, but were unsuited to the long structural members needed for roofs and for ships and for large buildings. Cedar from Lebanon, cypress from Cyprus, pine from the southern coast of Anatolia, and oak from the Italian and Iberian coasts all arrived at the harbors of Carthage, carried on the merchant ships of the city and of its trading partners. The cedar of Lebanon was the prestige timber used in the temple roofs and in the ceremonial doors of public buildings, and the records of the Tyrian shipping registers, preserved on Egyptian papyri, document the export of cedar to the western Phoenician colonies through the centuries of the city's growth. Glass was a minor but consistent product of the Carthaginian workshops. The technique was the older core-formed method, in which a sand and clay core was shaped into the desired form of the vessel, then dipped or trailed with molten glass, and the core was removed after cooling. The vessels produced were small bottles for cosmetic oil and perfume, with horizontal trails of contrasting glass in yellow and white and turquoise running around a body of dark blue. These small bottles appear in tombs throughout the city and along the routes of Punic trade, and they are one of the most recognizable Carthaginian export goods of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. Carthage stood at the geographical center of the Western Mediterranean and at the commercial center of the larger Phoenician trading world, and the volume and reach of its trade through the centuries of its independence was as much a part of its identity as the bronze of its votive razors or the purple of its dyed cloth. The commercial network of the city extended from the Atlantic coast of Iberia in the west to the Levantine ports of Tyre and Sidon in the east, from the metal mines of the Iberian interior in the north to the trans-Saharan caravan routes of the African interior in the south, and the volume of goods that passed through the harbors of Carthage at the height of the 3rd century before the Common Era was, by the estimates of modern economic historians of the ancient world, among the largest of any single port of the Mediterranean. The principal goods of the Western trade were the metals: silver from the Sierra Morena mines in southern Spain, the largest single source of silver in the Mediterranean world; tin from the British Isles, carried down the Atlantic seaboard by a route that ran through the Punic colonies of Gadir and Lixus and across the Bay of Biscay to the Cornish mines; iron from the Catalan coast and from the Pyrenees; copper from Sardinia and from the Rio Tinto deposits of the Iberian Peninsula; lead from the same Sierra Morena complex as the silver. The metals arrived in Carthage as ingots, the silver and the lead as flat rectangular bars cast in open molds, the copper and the tin as larger bar stock, and as the round flat cakes called talents; the iron as long bars of refined wrought iron called currency bars in the modern archaeological literature. From the harbor warehouses, the metals went either to the workshops of the city for working into finished goods, or onward to the eastern markets in the form of raw ingots. The eastern trade brought into Carthage the luxury goods of the Levant and of Egypt: linen and papyrus from the Nile Delta, glassware from the Phoenician workshops of Tyre and of Sidon, faience and decorative ivory from the same Levantine producers, dyed silk and worked silver from the inland markets of Mesopotamia, the goods of the spice routes from the Arabian Peninsula and from India arriving by way of the Egyptian Red Sea ports. The eastern trade ran on the same shipping that brought the western metals out, and the merchant houses of Carthage maintained agents and warehouses in the principal eastern ports throughout the period of the city's independence. The trade with the African interior moved on the caravan routes that ran south from the Mediterranean coast across the Atlas Mountains and into the Saharan oases. The goods that came north on these routes were ivory from the elephant herds of the Sahel, gold dust from the river deposits of the Western African Gold Belt, ostrich eggs and ostrich feather plumes for the markets of the Mediterranean cities, captives taken in the wars of the interior, and the various exotic skins and horns and tropical hardwoods that arrived in smaller quantities. The goods that went south in exchange were the manufactured products of the Carthaginian workshops: bronze tools, glass beads, finished textiles, salt from the coastal salinas, and the wine and the olive oil of the country estates. The trans-Saharan trade is harder to reconstruct from the archaeological record than the maritime trade, and most of what is known about it derives from the references of Greek and Latin writers, and from the indirect evidence of objects of Punic manufacture recovered from sites in the Sahel. The trade with the Greek world ran principally through the cities of Sicily and of southern Italy. Greek pottery, principally from the Corinthian and Attic workshops, arrived in Carthage in considerable volume from the 7th century onward, carried as cargo and as ballast on the merchant ships of both Greek and Punic operators. In exchange, Carthaginian goods reached the Greek markets: the murex purple, the bronze fittings of the Punic workshops, North African grain in the periods when the Sicilian harvest was insufficient, and the products of the trans-Saharan trade that the Greeks could not source through their own networks. The relationship was commercial through most of the centuries of contact, and turned military only in the long contest for Sicily that ran from the 5th century onward, and that culminated in the wars with Syracuse and eventually with Rome. The monetary system of Carthage was an unusual one. For most of the city's history, the merchants of Carthage operated on a system of pre-coinage silver weights, measured against standard weights kept in the temples and in the offices of the merchant houses. The smallest unit was the shekel, of about 7.5 grams of silver. The larger units were the mina of 50 shekels and the talent of 60 minae. Coinage proper began in the late 5th century before the Common Era, issued initially in Sicily during the wars with Syracuse and for the payment of the Carthaginian armies operating on the island, and only later issued at mints in the metropolitan area of the city itself. The coinage was electrum and gold in the higher denominations and silver in the lower, and the designs were dominated by the head of Tanit on the obverse and the war horse or the palm tree on the reverse, both of them symbols of the city itself. The shipping that carried the commerce of Carthage was of two principal types. The merchant ships proper were the round-bottomed sailing ships called galoi in the Greek sources and known from the underwater archaeological record of the western Mediterranean. The gallos was a sailing vessel of 15 to 20 meters in length, with a single mast, a square sail, and a steering oar at the stern. It carried between 50 and 100 tons of cargo, depending on the size, and ran the Mediterranean routes in convoy in the safer sailing months from April to October. The military ships of Carthage were the long-oared galleys, principally the quinquereme, a 5-banked oared warship of about 45 meters in length that was the standard heavy warship of the Mediterranean from the 4th century onward. The quinqueremes were housed in the covered ship sheds of the inner harbor and were brought out for the annual campaigning season or for emergency naval action. Beyond the trade in goods, Carthage was a center of skill exchange. The agricultural treatise of Mago circulated through the Mediterranean in the original Punic and later in Latin and in Greek translation, and it was the principal authority on Mediterranean agriculture for centuries after the emptying of the city. The Carthaginian system of stone construction, with its precision ashlar masonry and its underground vaulted cisterns, was adopted by the Numidian and the Mauritanian kingdoms of the African coast and influenced the construction of the inland cities of Thugga and Duga and Volubilis through the centuries of Roman occupation. The maritime navigation techniques of the city, including the use of celestial observation for offshore sailing and the systematic charting of coastlines, were also a Carthaginian inheritance that passed into the Roman naval tradition. In the late afternoon, the heat of the day lifted from the courtyards and the workshops of the lower city, and the rhythm of the streets shifted. The metal workers of the southern slope of Bursa banked their furnaces with damp ash and closed their shop fronts. The dye vats along the harbor frontage were covered with their wooden lids. The bakers' ovens, banked since the noon meal, gave off only a low warmth through the side streets. The light on the upper city turned amber, then orange, then the deep golden tone that follows the lowering of the sun over a Mediterranean coast, and the shadows of the multi-story houses fell long across the orthogonal streets toward the harbors below. The harbor district at evening was the busiest single space in the city. The merchant ships that had unloaded through the morning and the early afternoon were lashed at the bollards along the stone quays, their crews unloading the last of the cargo into the vaulted warehouses behind the quay. The amphorae of oil and of wine and of fish sauce came off in wicker slings hoisted by hand from the holds. The sacks of grain came off on the shoulders of porters who walked them up the loading planks. The bales of cloth and the bundles of cured hides came off on small two-wheeled handcarts hauled by single porters. The warehouses themselves were vaulted stone halls running back from the quay into the bedrock of the headland, their interiors cool and dry, suited to the long-term storage of foodstuffs and of trade goods, and the warehouses extended in a continuous line along the inland side of the outer harbor. The streets of the residential blocks above the harbor began to empty toward sunset. The shopkeepers closed the wooden shutters of their street-front shops, drew the inventory inside, and locked the doors. The leather workers and the metal workers packed up the day's finished goods and the day's tools. The cloth merchants rolled up their bolts of dyed wool and of linen and stowed them on the shelves at the back of the shop. The water carriers made their last trips of the day, bringing up the heavier evening water from the public wells and the public fountains for the household washing and for the preparation of the evening meal. The children who had spent the day at the temple porches with their letters and their tablets came down to the streets and ran to their houses, the older boys with armfuls of school tablets, and the younger ones empty-handed. Households gathered on the flat mud-brick roofs as the air cooled. The roofs were the principal social space of the Punic house in the long Mediterranean summers, set high enough above the streets to catch the evening breeze and to look out over the harbors toward the sea. The evening meal was eaten on the roof in the warmer months, the family seated on woven mats on the floor of the roof terrace, the food set on a low wooden table or on a stretched cloth between them. The meal was bread, olive oil, salted fish, dried figs and dates, occasional cheese from the goat herds of the inland plain, and a small portion of cooked meat on the days of festival or on the days when the household could afford it. The drink was wine, mixed with water in the Greek fashion, drunk from cups of fired clay or, in the wealthier households, of bronze or of imported Greek black figure ware. The temples of the city held their evening offerings at sunset. The temple of Eshmun on the summit of Bursa, the largest sanctuary, held the most elaborate of these. The priests presented to the cult statue a meal that mirrored the morning offering: loaves of bread, jars of new oil, portions of meat from the day's sacrifices, libations of wine and of milk. The offerings were withdrawn after a measured interval and consumed by the priesthood in the inner chambers of the temple precinct. From the slopes below the temple, the smoke of the burnt offerings rose in pale columns into the evening sky, and the smell of the burning fat and incense carried over the lower city as the light faded. The smaller shrines along the streets held their evening offerings on the household pattern. The householders themselves placed small loaves and cups of oil and portions of the evening meal on the thresholds and on the small stone altars set into the wall niches of the courtyards. The household dead were remembered in this evening ritual. The names of the recently deceased were spoken, and the small offerings were left in their honor. The continuity of the family across generations was a central religious concern in Punic culture, and the daily ritual of remembrance was as important as the larger festivals of the calendar. The harbor mouth was secured at sunset with a heavy chain stretched across the entrance from the two flanking towers, a precaution against night raiders and against the entry of unauthorized vessels. The garrison of the harbor towers settled the chain into place and lit the oil lamps that hung from the upper galleries, and the lamps remained lit through the night as a navigational mark for any vessel approaching the coast. The gates of the landward walls were closed at the same hour, the heavy bronze-bound wooden leaves drawn together by teams of men hauling on ropes, and the garrison of the inner ring of walls took up the night watch. The streets of the lower city were lit, where they were lit at all, by the oil lamps set in niches in the walls of the houses, and by the open lamps carried by individual citizens moving from one house to another. The Punic oil lamp of the Iron Age was a small open clay dish with a pinched lip to hold the wick a twist of linen or of papyrus pith soaked in olive oil. The light produced was a low yellow flame, sufficient to navigate the streets and to read by close to, but the streets of the city after dark were dim, and most of the citizens stayed in their houses or on their roofs after the closing of the gates. In the wealthier households, the evening sometimes extended into a symposium of the Greek pattern, an institution that the Carthaginian aristocracy adopted from its contact with the Greek cities of Sicily and of southern Italy. The symposium was a gathering of male guests in the dining room of the host, the guests reclining on couches arranged around the four walls of the room, a low table set before each couch, wine mixed with water and served from a central crater, and conversation continuing late into the night. The painted plaster of some of the dining rooms in the Hannibal Quarter shows the symposium iconography clearly. Garlands of leaves and flowers on the walls, painted couches in the room corners, and the standard repertoire of mythological and floral motifs of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. The city slept by the middle hours of the night. The harbor lamps continued to burn. The garrison of the gates and the towers held their watch. The temple precincts kept their attendants on duty. But the streets and the houses fell quiet, and the only sounds carrying through the dark were the wash of the harbor water against the quays, the slow creak of the moored ships shifting on their lines, and the calls of the night birds in the marshlands of the Sebca to the north. The Tophet of Carthage stood on the southern edge of the city, near the lagoon of the Lake of Tunis, an open-air precinct of stone-lined urns set into the ground in dense rows and each marked by a small carved stela of local limestone. The precinct extended over an area of roughly 6,000 square meters in its excavated portion, and the excavated urns, deposited in stratified layers from the 8th century before the Common Era until the emptying of the city in 146, number more than 20,000. Each urn held the cremated remains of an infant or a young child, and in some cases the remains of a small animal, a lamb, a kid, a young bird, and the urn was sealed with a stone lid and set into the ground beside the others of its season. The carved stelae that marked the urns followed a standardized iconographic program. The upper register held the symbol of the goddess Tennet, a triangle with a horizontal line at its apex and a disc set above the line, the discs sometimes pierced with a smaller circle and sometimes flanked by raised arms. The middle register held the dedicatory inscription, carved in the Punic script and naming the parents who had dedicated the offering, the deities to whom the offering was made, and the formula of the dedication. The lower register held the carved figures of the dedicators themselves, or representations of the offerings, or the symbols of Baal Hammon in the form of a seated bearded male figure with a crescent moon above his head. The stelae were arranged in dense fields, each of them shorter than a meter, and set vertically into the ground above its associated urn. The interpretation of the Tophet has been debated in the scholarly literature for more than a century. The earlier interpretation, drawn from the hostile testimony of Greek and Roman writers, was that the Tophet represented the institutionalized sacrifice of living children by the Carthaginian state in times of emergency, a practice attested in the literary sources for several specific moments in the city's history. The later interpretation, drawn from the careful study of the urn contents and of the demographic profile of the deceased, was that the Tophet served as a special cemetery for infants who had died of natural causes, stillbirths, neonatal deaths, deaths in early infancy, and that the dedicatory inscriptions reflected the parents' commendation of these short-lived children to the protective deities of the city. Both interpretations have their adherents in the current scholarship, and the question is unlikely to be settled definitively from the available evidence. What can be said with certainty is that the Tophet was a religious institution of central importance to the Punic city through the entire span of its independent existence, that its inscriptions name particular families and individuals across many generations, and that it stood under the joint patronage of Baal Hammon and Tanit, the principal protective deities of the city. The other temples of the city held their own rituals on a different rhythm. The temple of Eshmun, on the summit of Bursa, was the principal sanctuary of the city's healing god, and it functioned as a center for the cure of illness and for the dedication of votive offerings made in fulfillment of vows undertaken during illness. The dedications were of small bronze figurines representing the affected body part, of inscribed limestone plaques recording the cure, and of personal items belonging to the recovered patient. The temple held a permanent priestly staff, organized in a hierarchy of grades and inherited within particular Carthaginian families, and the chief priest of Eshmun held a position of social and political prominence in the city. The temple of Melkart at the harbor was older, dating from the original Phoenician foundation of the city in the late 9th century, before the Common Era. Its rites resembled those of the parent shrine at Tyre on the Levantine coast, with whom the Carthaginian sanctuary maintained a formal ritual connection through the periodic dispatch of embassies and the payment of an annual tithe in silver. The Melkart of Tyre was the patron deity of the mother city, and the Melkart of Carthage was therefore the patron deity of the colony, the guardian of its maritime ventures, and the protector of its merchants on the long sea routes of the Mediterranean. The annual festival of Melkart, held in the spring at the opening of the sailing season, involved the lighting of a great pyre on the headland at the harbor mouth and the offering of a portion of the New Year's first cargo to the god. The temple of Resheph, the war god, lay on the western slope of Bursa and held its principal rituals in connection with the campaigning season. Before a major expedition, the army's commanders would offer sacrifices at the temple, and the standards of the army would be blessed in the temple's forecourt. The temple of Astarte, the consort of Melkart, stood on the Juno Hill north of Bursa, and its rituals concerned the fertility of the fields and of the herds and of the households. The smaller shrines distributed throughout the city, household shrines, neighborhood shrines, shrines associated with particular trades and professions, held their own rituals on the patterns appropriate to their dedications. The household religion of the Punic city centered on the cult of the family ancestors and on the daily offerings to the protective deities of the household. Each house held a small shrine in a wall niche of the courtyard or of a principal room, the shrine containing a small terracotta statue of the deity venerated by the household, a small altar for daily offerings, and a stone or terracotta basin for libations. The morning and evening offerings on this household shrine were performed by the senior male or senior female member of the household, depending on the family's tradition, and the offerings consisted of small portions of bread and oil and wine drawn from the household stores. The names of the recently deceased members of the family were spoken at these offerings, and the continuity of the family across generations was preserved in this daily ritual remembrance. The burial customs of Carthage were elaborate. The cemeteries lay outside the walls on the slopes of the Juno Hill to the north and along the coast to the south of the harbors. The tombs were rock-cut shafts descending 2 to 4 meters from the surface to a horizontal chamber cut into the bedrock, the chamber large enough to hold a body on a stone bench, and the associated grave goods around it. The grave goods of a typical adult burial included pottery vessels of local and imported manufacture, personal jewelry of bronze and of silver, occasional gold ornaments in the wealthier burials, small bronze tools, oil lamps, and amulets of faience and of bone. The shaft was filled with earth and rubble after the burial, and a small stela was sometimes set above the shaft on the surface of the cemetery. Family tombs accumulated burials across generations, with successive interments laid on benches at different levels of the chamber, and the earlier burials sometimes moved to the back of the chamber to make room for the new arrival. The agricultural year of the Carthaginian Cora followed the rhythm of the Mediterranean climate, divided into the two principal phases of the cool, wet winter and the hot, dry summer, with the brief transitional seasons of spring and autumn marking the major points of agricultural activity. The treatise of Mago, written in the 3rd or perhaps the early 2nd century before the Common Era, and preserved in Latin and Greek translation after the emptying of the city, organized its agricultural instructions around the calendar of the year, and the surviving fragments allow a reasonable reconstruction of the agricultural seasons as the Carthaginian aristocracy understood and managed them. Winter began with the arrival of the first sustained rains in late October or early November, and it ran through to the end of April. The work of the winter season opened with the plowing of the fields that had been left fallow the previous year, and the sowing of the winter grain crops, barley first, and then wheat, on the heavy clay soils of the inland Cora. The plows of the Carthaginian estates were of the iron-tipped wooden type drawn by paired oxen, and the plowing was done in the fields running parallel to the slope of the land to limit the loss of soil to the winter rains. The cisterns of the houses and the estates filled during the winter rains, and the larger reservoirs of the country estates accumulated the water that would be needed through the long dry summer for the irrigation of the orchards and the kitchen gardens. The olives of the previous autumn's harvest were pressed in the winter months, the oil pressed from the milled olives flowing into stone vats from which it was decanted into amphorae for storage and for export. Spring brought the grain harvest. The barley ripened first, in the lower altitude fields of the Megara plain, harvested with iron-bladed sickles in the long days of April, and threshed on the open-air threshing floors of the country estates by the slow circling of oxen drawing wooden sledges over the cut grain. The wheat ripened later, on the higher fields of the inland Cora, and was harvested through May and into early June. The threshed grain was winnowed in the late afternoon breezes and stored in vaulted underground granaries or in large terracotta jars set into the floors of the storerooms of the country villas. Spring was also the season of the lambing and the kidding of the small flocks of the inland plain, and the milk of the goats and the sheep was processed into cheese and into the fermented dairy drinks that were a staple of the Punic country diet. The vines began their growth in the spring, with the new shoots emerging from the carefully pruned stalks of the previous season's vineyards, and the long work of training and pruning the vines continued through the spring and the early summer. Summer was the season of the long-distance fleets and of the maritime trade. The merchant ships of Carthage and of its trading partners ran the Mediterranean routes from the opening of the sailing season in April to the closing of the season in October, taking advantage of the steady Etesian winds that blew from the north through the height of the summer. The harbors of the city were at their busiest in the summer months, and the volume of trade running through the outer harbor in a typical summer day in the 3rd century before the Common Era was the highest of any single port in the western Mediterranean. The country estates of the Cora ran on a lighter agricultural schedule during the summer, with the main effort going to the maintenance of the orchards and the vineyards, and to the careful management of the irrigation water from the spring reservoirs. The household activities of the city itself slowed in the long midday heat, with the streets emptying for the early afternoon hours and the inhabitants retreating to the cooler interior rooms and the roof terraces. Autumn opened with the grape harvest in September. The grapes of the country estates were picked from the vines by hand and carried to the stone-built wine presses of the villas, where they were trodden by foot in a wide stone basin, and the juice drained into a series of fermentation vats set below the basin in the floor. The fermentation continued through October and into November, and the new wine was decanted into clay amphorae and sealed with stoppers of cork and clay for storage and for export. The olive harvest followed in late October, and through November, the olives gathered from the trees with long poles and collected into baskets, then milled in the stone mills of the estates and pressed in the screw presses or in the older liver presses of the country villas. The fig harvest, smaller in commercial volume but important in the household diet, ran from August through October, and the figs were dried on rooftop racks for storage and for trade. Autumn was also the season of the closing of the long-distance fleets, with the last merchant ships running into harbor in October before the onset of the autumn storms, and the Gaulois were drawn into the boatyards along the harbor frontage for the winter haul-out and repair. The fishing season of the lower Gulf followed a different rhythm from the agricultural year. The tuna of the Mediterranean migrated through the western basin in two principal runs, the larger run in the late spring and the smaller in the autumn, and the tuna fisheries of the Punic coast were timed to these runs. The fixed nets called madrags in the later Mediterranean tradition, anchored across the migration paths of the tuna in the waters off the headland, were set in the spring and removed in the autumn, and the catch was processed in the salting houses along the shore south of the harbors. The smaller daily fishery for sea bream and sardines and the lagoon fish of the Sebca continued year-round, with the seasonal variations in species and in volume that the migrations of the Mediterranean fish populations produced. The ritual calendar of the city was coordinated with the agricultural calendar, though the formal correspondences are not fully recoverable from the surviving evidence. The Tophet inscriptions cluster in particular months, suggesting that the dedication of urns followed a seasonal rhythm associated with the agricultural and religious year. The spring opening of the sailing season was marked by the festival of Melkart at the harbor temple, with the lighting of the great pyre on the headland and the offering of the New Year's first cargo. The autumn pressing of the new wine and the new oil was marked by festivals at the country estates and by the bringing of first fruit offerings to the temples of the city. The midwinter festival of Tanit, at the time of the shortest days, involved a procession from the temple of Tanit on the Juno Hill to the precinct of the Tophet and the lighting of lamps along the route. The country estates of the Kora, set across the wide plain of the Megara and the inland valleys, were the principal producers of the agricultural surplus that fed the city and supplied its export trade. The largest of these estates ran to several hundred hectares of cultivated land and held populations of agricultural laborers in the hundreds, organized under the authority of an estate manager who reported to the absentee landlord in the city. The treatise of Mago dealt at considerable length with the management of these estates, with the selection and the discipline of the workforce, with the rotation of crops on the heavy clay soils, with the construction of the wine and oil presses, with the maintenance of the cisterns and the irrigation channels, and with the seasonal calendar of work that organized the year on the estate. The unraveling of Carthage was not a single event, but a long process of attrition that ran from the conclusion of the First Punic War in 241 before the Common Era to the emptying of the city in 146. The First Punic War, which ran from 264 to 241, ended in the loss of Sicily to Rome and in the imposition of a large indemnity to be paid over a period of years. The financial pressures of the indemnity, combined with the breakdown of the relationship between the Carthaginian government and its mercenary armies upon their return from Sicily, produced the so-called Mercenary War of 241 to 237, a brutal civil conflict fought across the African Chora, and concluded only by the systematic suppression of the rebel armies by the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca. The Second Punic War, which ran from 218 to 201, ended in the defeat of Hannibal Barca's expedition to Italy and in the conclusion of a treaty that confined Carthage to its African territory, prohibited it from declaring war without Roman permission, and required the payment of a further large indemnity over 50 years. The 50-year period that followed the conclusion of the Second Punic War was, paradoxically, one of significant economic recovery for the city. The records of the Carthaginian state during this period, preserved in the inscriptions of the Tophet and in the indirect evidence of the maritime archaeology of the Western Mediterranean, indicate that the harbors continued to operate, that the dye houses continued to produce, that the merchant fleet was reconstituted, and that the volume of trade running through the city recovered to a substantial fraction of its pre-war levels. The population of the city in the middle decades of the 2nd century before the Common Era has been estimated by modern demographic historians at perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, a figure that would make it one of the largest cities of the Mediterranean of the period. The indemnity was paid in full and ahead of schedule, and the Carthaginian government in 151, before the Common Era, formally requested release from the prohibition on declaring war in order to defend its African territories against the increasingly aggressive Numidian king Massinissa. The Roman Senate's response to this recovery was the famous senatorial demand, urged repeatedly by the censor Marcus Porcius Cato at the close of every Senate speech, regardless of the topic, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be erased, that the city be removed as an independent power. In 149 before the Common Era, citing alleged violations of the Treaty of Tuhov I, in the form of Carthaginian military preparations against Massiniss's encroachments, the Senate declared war for what came to be known as the Third Punic War. The Carthaginian government, after a confused diplomatic exchange in which it surrendered its arms and its hostages in the hope of avoiding the conflict, was informed of the Senate's final terms: that the inhabitants of the city were to abandon the coast, march 10 miles inland, and rebuild their settlement at a distance from the sea. The Carthaginians refused. The city's existence as a maritime commercial center was its existence. A Carthage without the sea was no Carthage. The population voted in assembly to defend the city, and the long siege began in the summer of 149. The defense was conducted by the citizen body itself, supplemented by the inhabitants of the Chora who took refuge within the walls, and the population of the besieged city through the 3 years of the siege has been estimated at between 100 and 150,000. The walls of the city, the triple ring described by Polybius and still standing in their full elevation at the start of the siege, held for 2 years against the besieging Roman armies under the successive command of 2 Roman consuls who proved insufficient to the task. The harbor was blockaded by the Roman fleet. The supplies from the Chora were cut off by the encirclement of the landward walls, and the besieged inhabitants reduced their rations progressively through the autumn and winter of 148 to 147, and again through the autumn and winter of 147 to 146. The command of the Roman armies passed in early 147 to Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the elder Africanus who had concluded the Second Punic War. Scipio Aemilianus tightened the blockade by building a mole across the entrance to the outer harbor, cutting the city off completely from the sea. The Carthaginian response was to open a new harbor entrance through the bedrock of the headland and to build a new fleet within the inner harbor through the winter of 147 to 146, an undertaking that the surviving sources describe in some detail and that the archaeological evidence of the harbor complex partially confirms. The new fleet emerged from the new harbor mouth in the spring of 46, gave battle to the Roman fleet, and was defeated. The final assault on the walls came in the spring of 146. The Roman armies broke into the lower city through the harbor district, took the agora, and then began the long advance up the slope of Bursa toward the citadel. The fighting was conducted street by street and house by house, with the defenders fighting from the upper stories of the multi-story houses against the Roman troops in the streets below. The Roman armies set fire to each house as it was cleared, and the fire spread through the upper city as the advance continued. The final defense was made at the temple of Eshmun on the summit of Bursa, where the surviving defenders, including the wife and children of the Carthaginian commander Hasdrubal, took refuge in the precinct. Hasdrubal himself surrendered to Scipio. His wife and children, according to the surviving accounts, perished in the burning temple by their own choice. The dismantling that followed the breaching of the walls was systematic. Scipio Aemilianus, acting on the explicit instructions of the Senate, ordered the city emptied of its surviving inhabitants, who were sold into slavery, the buildings of the city pulled down, the harbors filled in, and the site declared cursed for the planting of grain. The later tradition that the site was sown with salt is a medieval embellishment without basis in the ancient sources, but the substance of the dismantling is well attested. The destruction layer that excavators have traced beneath the foundations of the later Roman city is in places more than a meter thick, consisting of burned mud brick, broken pottery, ash, and the carbonized remains of the timber framing of the multi-story houses. Among the preserved objects in this layer are the painted plaster fragments of the Hannibal Quarter, the contents of household storage vessels, the bones of human and animal casualties of the final week, and the inscribed materials of the temples and the public archives. For the century following the emptying of the city, the site lay vacant under the Roman curse. In 122 before the Common Era, Gaius Gracchus attempted a Roman colonial foundation at the site, but the project was abandoned within a few years on the grounds of the religious prohibition. The lasting Roman foundation, the Colonia of Carthago, was finally established by Julius Caesar in 44 and by Augustus in 29 before the Common Era, with the religious prohibition lifted by senatorial action. The new Roman city was laid out on a grid orientation that partially preserved the Punic street pattern beneath it, and the new construction rose directly on the destruction layer of the Punic city below. The Roman Carthage of the imperial period became one of the principal cities of the empire, the seat of the governor of the province of Africa Proconsularis, and the population, through the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, reached, again, several 100,000 inhabitants. The promontory of Carthage today lies inside the northeastern suburbs of the modern city of Tunis, an administrative arrondissement of low villas and shaded streets that takes its name from the ancient city beneath it. The hill of Byrsa, the central summit of the Punic and Roman city, is now occupied at its highest point by the buildings of the former French Cathedral of St. Louis, built in the 19th century during the French Protectorate, and now serving as a museum and cultural center. On the slopes below the cathedral, the archaeological park of the Hannibal Quarter preserves the cleared block of Punic houses excavated by French and Tunisian teams through the second half of the 20th century. The painted plaster of the lower walls of these houses is still in places visible behind protective glass, the painted patterns of red and white and yellow still legible against the lime ground, the room layouts of the Punic domestic plan still readable in the standing wall stubs. The circular military harbor survives as a quiet inland pond, the curve of its ancient quay still ringing the modern shoreline of the small lagoon that fills the basin. At low tide, the bedrock cuts of the ship sheds are still visible along the inner edge of the quay, the slipway grooves cut into the soft yellow sandstone of the headland, still tracing the position of each of the 170 sheds that ringed the basin. The central island of the inner harbor, on which stood the admiral's offices and the colonnaded gallery overlooking the moored fleet, is now a low grassy mound rising slightly above the water. The outer harbor, the rectangular commercial basin opening onto the Gulf, has been largely silted in and is now a flat tract of low marshy ground at the foot of the slope of Bursa, traceable in the topography of the modern shoreline, but no longer functioning as a basin. The Tafet at Salambo, on the southern edge of the ancient city near the lagoon of the Lake of Tunis, is preserved as an open archaeological area within the modern urban fabric. The excavated portion of the precinct, fenced and roofed in part, presents the visitor with a dense field of standing stelae among the lower stone-lined urn settings, the stelae replicas in some areas and originals in others, the originals taken to the Carthage National Museum on the hill of Bursa for protection from weathering. The site is walked at dusk by small numbers of visitors moving slowly among the stelae, the carved figures of Tanit and of Baal Hammon still legible in the upper register of each standing stone, the dedicatory Punic inscriptions still legible on the better preserved examples. The Antonine Baths on the lower shoreline north of the inner harbor are the most visually substantial of the surviving Roman monuments of the site. The baths, built under the Emperor Antoninus Pius in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era, covered an area of around 4 hectares and rose to a height of more than 30 meters in their central vaults. The standing remains are now of the lower walls and the substructures of the heating systems, with the upper stories collapsed and the column drums of the great central hall scattered in fields across the lower terraces. The Roman cisterns at La Malga, on the higher ground inland from the baths, are a complex of 15 parallel vaulted chambers running back into the hillside, each more than 100 meters long, and the chambers are still entered and walked by visitors interested in the engineering of the late Roman water supply. The Carthage National Museum, on the summit of Bursa beside the buildings of the former cathedral, holds the principal collection of objects recovered from the excavations of the site. The painted plaster fragments of the Hannibal Quarter are displayed in dedicated galleries, alongside the limestone stelae of the Tafet, the carved sarcophagi of the priestly and aristocratic burials of the necropolis at Saint Monique, the painted pottery of the Punic ceramic tradition and the imported Greek wares, the bronze fittings and personal objects of the metal industry, and the inscribed materials of the public archives. The museum's collections are arranged chronologically and topically, and the careful labeling of the Punic period materials in French and Arabic and English allows the visitor to follow the development of the city's material culture across the 7 centuries of its independent existence. The archaeological investigation of the site has continued through the 20th and into the 21st centuries under a partnership of Tunisian and French and German and American and other foreign teams. The UNESCO Save Carthage campaign of the 1970s coordinated the systematic excavation of large parts of the site under the direction of the Tunisian National Institute of Heritage, and the resulting publications constitute the principal modern reference for the archaeology of Punic Carthage. More recent fieldwork has concentrated on the publication of the older excavations, on the targeted investigation of specific questions of urban topography, and on the conservation of the standing remains against the pressures of urban development. The promontory is inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List as a single property, combining the Punic city, the Roman city, and the medieval and modern occupation that succeeded them. The modern town of Carthage that occupies the surface of the ancient site is a residential and administrative district of the Greater Tunis area, with the presidential palace of the Tunisian Republic occupying a portion of the upper hill of Birsa, and with the official residence of a number of foreign ambassadors set in villas along the shaded streets of the lower terraces. The integration of the archaeological remains with the modern urban fabric has been carefully managed through restrictive zoning and through the maintenance of archaeological green spaces around the principal monuments. The visitor walking the streets of the modern town in the late afternoon passes the standing remains of the Antonine Baths to the north, the cleared block of Punic houses on the upper slope of Bursa, the open precinct of the Tophet to the south, and the curve of the inner harbor below the hill, and the topographical relationship of these monuments to one another preserves the spatial logic of the ancient city, even where the buildings themselves no longer stand. In the late afternoon, the light on the headland takes on the long amber tone characteristic of the Mediterranean coast in the hours before sunset, and the modern villas of the residential streets cast their shadows across the cleared Punic walls of the archaeological park. The sea on the eastern horizon turns from blue to gold to deep orange as the sun lowers behind the inland hills. The wash of the waves against the lower shoreline carries the same sound it carried 2,500 years ago, the same brackish smell of the harbor water, the same slow movement of the tide against the worn bedrock of the headland. The pattern is still legible in the spacing of the walls and in the curve of the inner harbor. In the gathering evening, on the slope of Bursa, the stones remain.